what would the founders do if they showed up today? Would they propose a similar government? No. What would they propose? And if so, if we use that frame of reference, the Constitution of itself is amendable. Are there amendments that one would make today to make the form more suited to the matter to protect safety and happiness of the people?
No, I mean, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. Let me start with the no. Let me start with the parts they would not change. Take the 14th Amendment, which everyone is using today to as a weapon against the American way of life and the older way of life of the people. What the 14th Amendment actually originally meant was nothing more than the state governments are obliged to protect the rights of all citizens, period. It didn't mean affirmative action. It didn't mean women that you can't have male and female bathrooms. It didn't mean that women had to be given equal job opportunity in the job market. None of that. All they meant was if somebody harms you, you get prosecuted, or at least you can sue the person who harms you. And adding the idea of basic citizen rights, the 14th Amendment, one of the privileges of citizenship. What are those privileges? The right to travel, the right to go into business on the same terms as anyone else, the right to set up a school on any terms you like, set up a business. All of the things that used to be considered privileges of citizenship are now abolished or greatly curtailed. This is the point of Christopher Caldwell's book. Once you have the civil rights regime, you don't have privileges of citizenship in the 14th Amendment sense of the word. I think the founders would be overjoyed if the 14th Amendment were actually enforced as written. And I think you can go down the line here. Let's take another example, voting rights. What did the founders say about voting rights? They didn't say everyone should vote. They said the bulk of the people should vote. But they also made the point that the bulk of the people who are voting need to be independent, need to have some property, some independence. They need to be at least minimally taxpayers. They can't be on the dole. They can't be paupers, as they used to call it. Think of what would happen to our country if we had restored the denial of vote to the pauper, someone who is dependent for the majority of his income on government and who's not working, for the government. Think of the idea that it was assumed that people who voted would be literate. What if you had literacy requirements, not in the sense the old South used to do it, where they were fake? How about if you had real literacy requirements? People needing to be able to read things that are written in English. That's what the founders would immediately say. What the hell's going on with you people, all these people voting, who A, are not even citizens in many cases, and B, they don't speak English, they don't know anything about the country, and in many cases they're on the dole, right? They're being supported by the government, which means they have an interest in simply voting for whatever the government wants them to. That was one of the great insights of the founders. Don't give the right to vote to people who are just going to use their vote to vote in the interest of somebody they're dependent on. Now, you can't completely do away with that dependence, but you can at least try to minimize it by having some of these kinds of limitations on voting. I think, America would be far better governed today if we had any of those kinds of changes. I could keep going down the list. What about elections? If you had elections would be better if you had a more intelligent electorate that was limited in the way I've just mentioned, not dependent, taxpayers. People who have educated, people who are citizens. How about the idea of dual citizenship? Talk about an idea the founders would have thought was insane. Well, I'm a citizen of Israel, and I'm a citizen of the United States, and I'm a citizen of France, and I'm a citizen of Canada. I have a friend who actually fits those categories. And they would have said, it's like a spouse, right? Pick one and stick to it. You don't get to have multiple spouses or countries.
I believe my passport says that I only have one allegiance, but I guess that's not very well enforced. And I do remember reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. And I bring this up because the role of education is really important in all these things that we're discussing. I spent 10 years running charter schools in Washington, D.C. We would turn around the worst performing schools and help kids in the inner city. And in that public choice experiment, I was exposed to a lot of really bad education. And I have seen in the writings, I've seen in Lincoln discussing a political religion, the founders talking about using education to foster a love of American patriotism or American republicanism and patriotism. Even Reagan talking about this later on in history. That is clearly gone. The schools are no longer used to foster a love of country, a love of republicanism, a love of America, patriotism. But what isn't gone is the people who understand the power of educating the children to become the type of political citizen that they desire. What's happened is that the education system has been taken over by people who still understand this power, as well as Adams did and Washington did, and they all did, as they explain very clearly in your book. You show how they explain very clearly that we need to create schools to foster a love of Republican government and patriotism in American history. The people in charge now understand the power of controlling the children. How did we get to the point in which we're literally teaching kids to hate what America stands for? And what is the long-term impact of that on America as a political project? And what do we do about it?
Yeah, that point you're making about the older understanding of education in America, that was not only true at the time of the founding and afterwards. That was also one of the major agenda items of the earlier progressives, who conservatives are sometimes taught to hate. But there are many things the progressives got right. The progressives invented the Pledge of Allegiance. That was the idea. Let's these immigrants, we're being flooded with immigrants. Fine, let's try to at least do the best we can to make them into Americans. They immediately required them to go to public schools, all English immersion, no dual language situation. Nobody was respectful of anybody's culture from abroad. I mean, it was you're here, you're going to learn the American way of life, and you're always happy. We're always welcome to go back to your home country, wherever you came from. That was the older view. Very confident. The older progressives, super confident in Western civilization. They shared that in common with the founders, in spite of all their other differences with the founders. Post 60s, of course, now we're being told the American tradition sucks. The Western civilization is nothing but one long story of evil. The history of the white race is a history of how cancer metastasized throughout the world and became more and more pernicious and destructive. We are being taught that. That's what I'm talking about. That's our ruling classes today think that is what government should do, because they don't like that older American way of life. They don't think it's good. It's a question of justice here. The claim is that older American way of life, as long as you give individuals in private freedom, individual liberty, that will be used to the disadvantage of the weakest among us, the downtrodden, the weak, the sick, and so on. Everything has to then be reorganized to promote the well-being of those classes considered to be client groups of government. And the whole history of Western civilization from the beginning was a story of this kind of oppression. Men oppressing women, whites oppressing blacks, and so on. You have the whole narrative, Catholics oppressing Jews. Everything is always about oppression. Everything has been a history of oppression. So I'll say that the ruling class, of course, right now in America, the ruling class, which happens to be very highly tied in with the corporate elite and big government, big media, big education, big everything. Sure, they have private interest in the way things are being done now. They have a private interest. They have a personal interest in destroying middle America. But at the same time, they have a belief that what they're doing is just and right. And I think it's important for conservatives to understand both to understand the belief that these current liberals have in their project, and at the same time their hostility towards a way of life that involves a high degree of personal responsibility, personal liberty, freedom of private association, and all the rest.